Singer werd vooral bekend door zijn boek Animal Liberation uit 1975. Het basisboek voor heel wat dierenrechtenverenigingen en inspiratiebron voor het Dierenbevrijdingsfront.
Just over 2 hours ago, we released some rabbits from a laboratory animal supplier. This is part of an intensive campaign against the atrocities involved in animal experimentation.
If humans have rights, then animals must have rights too. Just because they can suffer, we have to take that suffering into account. We have to give equal consideration to the suffering of animals as we would give to the suffering of humans. I came to the University of Oxford as a graduate student in 1969, and at that point I had not really thought about the ethics of how we ought to treat animals. I'd grown up in Australia, which is a country that produces a lot of meat, and like most Australians, I'd eaten a lot of meat. I had always been opposed to cruelty to animals, like any decent person would be. But I had assumed that this was not really a major issue, that we had societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, and that they basically looked after that problem. And it was only a chance meeting with some other graduate students that led me to think about that issue and raise the question of whether there was something more systematically wrong with our attitudes to animals. And to think about the fact that we raise animals and turn them into meat and use them in laboratories and use them in circuses or zoos for our entertainment. And that in all these things, we are doing things that are harmful to them, particularly in the case, say, of factory farming, where we confine them very closely in conditions where they can't go outside or can't walk around, sometimes even can't turn around. And we do that just really for our convenience, because it means that we get meat or eggs a little bit more cheaply. I started thinking about that, and at first it was really a challenge to say, well, how do we justify the way we treat animals? But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, really, you can't justify this. We don't have any, of course, I don't believe we have a God-given right to use animals or anything like that. So if we consider suffering as a bad thing, why would we think that the suffering of animals doesn't matter, but human suffering always matters very much? I began to see this discrimination against animals as discrimination on the basis of species. And just as it's wrong to discriminate against someone because they're of a different race, and of course it's wrong to say that we care less about the interests of people who are of African descent or something of that sort. So I thought, well, it's really also irrelevant that a being is not a member of the species Homo sapien. I mean, if it can suffer, that's what's important, not whether it's Pan-troglodytes or Homo sapien or some other species. Of course, the fact that it's not human might mean it has different needs and different interests, and perhaps it doesn't suffer in quite the same ways that we do. But insofar as it can suffer, and insofar as we can compare the suffering of an animal with the suffering of a human, I came to realize that it was wrong to give less weight to the suffering of the animal.
What kind of impact do you think the book had?
Animal Liberation now was published about 35 years ago, and I'm happy to say that it's never been out of print in 35 years, which is unusual for a book now. They tend to have relatively short lives. So it's obviously proved of enduring interest. I'm also always pleased that whenever I speak on this topic, people come up to me and many of them say things like, I read Animal Liberation 10 years ago and I became a vegetarian and I've been one ever since. I also know that the book has had some influence on the political movement for animals in helping to start the modern animal rights movement, which exists everywhere. On the other hand, I couldn't really say that I'm content because the abuse of animals still continues. I mean, there have been improvements. There's been better legislation, particularly in Europe, against some of the worst abuses of factory farming. And some of the things that used to happen in laboratories that I described in the first edition of the book would not today get through an animal ethics committee. So there is some progress, but there are still many things that happen that I think are completely wrong and still based on speciesism. So I'm not content, because I could only be content if everybody really read and understood the arguments of the book and said, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to participate in the exploitation of animals. And then it would stop. I mean, this is in a way an easy thing to stop if only enough people would commit themselves to not contributing to the exploitation of animals by, for example, buying the meat or eggs that come from the exploitation of animals.
How does, in your philosophical way of thinking, how does your book Animal Liberation connect to your bioethical points of view? Is there a logical connection that you can explain?
Once you start rejecting the idea of species as being morally crucial, it does have some consequences for bioethics. I mean, it doesn't determine everything I think about bioethics. But one of the things that you immediately notice when you shift to bioethics is this idea of the sanctity of human life. And that makes a sharp contrast with the way we think about animal life. Because we seem to think and we say that all human life is sacrosanct, and therefore, at least in most countries, I know this is not true in Belgium, but in most countries, it's illegal to take a human life, even if that is a terminally ill patient who is asking you, the doctor, for assistance in dying. And in most countries of the world, you can't do that. So there's a strange thing, if you like, that the idea of the sanctity of human life says you can't do that to a human. But, of course, if your dog gets cancer and is dying, everyone would agree that you should take your dog to the vet and the vet should put the dog out of its misery. So here's a strange phenomenon that the sanctity of human life actually makes it worse for humans who want to die than it does for a dog who's terminally ill. So that's one of the things that I've argued, that we should not think that human life in itself is sacrosanct in this way, and that animal life can be taken so trivially. We should look rather at the consequences of what we're doing in each case. And that's why I have been an advocate for laws allowing voluntary euthanasia as exist in Belgium and the Netherlands, and have also advocated that sometimes in the case of severely disabled newborn infants where the parents and the doctors agree in consultation that it would be better if the infant not lived, that it should be permitted to carry out euthanasia there as well. So that's one respect in which you could say, by looking at this boundary we draw between animals and humans and coming to the conclusion that it should not be as sharp a boundary as we currently draw it, that does have some consequences for bioethics.